good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Megan Rowling. I am the editor of Zilient.org and a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. This month on our Zilient Live, we are going to be discussing Reinventing Islands as living laboratories for resilience. And the reason that we're doing this event today is because all week we are running a series on the resilience of islands. We are putting out stories every single day, and we have also done a multimedia piece bringing together those stories and explaining what's going on in islands, which is not all negative, contrary to what we might believe from the media at times. The URL for our multimedia piece, if you'd like to have a look at it, is http://reinventingislands.trust.org. Now, the key reason why we have a focus today on the Caribbean region are hurricanes Maria and Irma, which of course devastated some countries in that region last September. The deaths and destruction that were caused by these storms, particularly in places like Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands and Barbuda, brought home why efforts to build resilience in island nations and territories are crucial, especially if things are going to get worse with climate change. About 2 weeks ago, when I was preparing to put out a story on the British Virgin Islands about rebuilding after Irma, it just so happened that Tropical Storm Beryl formed in the region and strengthened into the first hurricane of the 2018 season, and that got everybody very worried. There were warnings going out in Puerto Rico and other places across the region. Now, luckily, that storm calmed down and dissipated before it hit land, and that was obviously a relief. And, you know, scientists are saying that in the future, climate change may contribute to making hurricanes more powerful. But it's not just the warming of the planet that brings higher stakes for islands. They face many different stresses, from coastal erosion to water shortages, plastic pollution, degradation of coral reefs and biodiversity, as well as migration issues. Despite their vulnerability of these islands, where the cost of living is higher and logistics are pretty complicated, many of them are trying out their own solutions to the problems that they face. And these are the focus of our series of stories that we're running this week on Zilient.org. They include, for example, adopting clean energy, growing more food locally, treating salt water to make it drinkable, conserving natural flood barriers, and using technology to manage scarce resources better. So we're going to talk about some of those solutions today, and we're also going to talk about where the money will come from to fund some of this innovation, which is a major barrier to rolling it out on the scale needed. And we're also going to ask how lessons learned on islands can be shared and used in other places like cities. So today we've got some great island experts with us to discuss all of this. We have Angela Burnett Penn, who has been Climate Change Officer for the British Virgin Islands for the past decade, and is author of the Irma Diaries. This is a book that documents local people's experiences of that horrific storm. Angela also authored the Virgin Islands Climate Change Adaptation Policy and helped lead the development of its Climate Change Trust Fund. Then we have Kate Brown, who is Executive Director of the Global Island Partnership, which is a platform that enables island leaders and their supporters to take action to build resilient and sustainable island communities. Kate's originally from New Zealand and lived for 8 years in Samoa. We have Axel de Vries, who is Manager for Advisory Services with EY Dutch Caribbean. He has a special focus on helping startup companies grow and is based on Curacao, a Dutch Caribbean island located about 40 miles north of the Venezuelan coast. And then we will have a discussant, Stewart Sarkozy-Banoczy, who is founder of Precovery Labs, he'll explain to you what that is, and director of the Island Resilience Initiative, which sits under the Global Islands Partnership. So as we're listening to our speakers in the first section of today's event, you can put your questions into the chat if you're watching on Zoom. please don't hold back on that. Or if you're tuning into the live broadcast on Facebook, you can also put questions into the comment section. And just to let you know, we'll be tweeting live during the event from our Twitter handle, which is @Zilient, and we're using the hashtag Reinventing Islands, which is the same hashtag that we've been using all week for our series of stories. So we're going to start by asking Angela Burnett to tell us a little more about the book that she put together in just a few short weeks after Hurricane Irma hit the British Virgin Islands. And she's also going to read a couple of excerpts for us, just to give us a real sense of that experience that survivors went through. Angela.
Good morning or good afternoon to everyone that is joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. And thank you, Megan, for that introduction. Basically, the Irma Diaries is a collection of 25 survivor stories from the British Virgin Islands, capturing the experience during Hurricane Irma, everything from preparing for the storm to actually going through the extremes of the hurricane, coming to grips with the aftermath and the forced decisions really that confronted persons after the hurricane. And I put this book together because it became very clear to me that despite all of the media coverage that was happening globally, there was really a disconnect between what had happened during the storm and realities on the ground and how that was being portrayed in the media, one. And two, I realized that there's an opportunity really for us to use these incredible stories to hopefully bridge more personal, tangible connections to climate change, which over the past 10 years now of working in the climate change arena, I've come to the realization that I think it's really this disconnect that is holding back much of the scale of action that we need to see when it comes to climate change. You know, studies show that many persons still perceive it as a very distant, far off threat, you know, not happening now, not hurting anybody. And the reality is entirely different. So this book is an attempt to really bring climate change to the world in a very visceral, tangible way, and hopefully a very natural way that persons interested in the hurricane experience then become, you know, drawn into climate change and what it really means. So that's the Irma Diaries. I'm not sure if you're seeing the slide right now with the cover of the book, but basically this is the book here. It's available on Amazon. It's available through the book's website, theirmadiaries.com, for purchase. And actually when persons purchase the book, 50% of the profits from purchases are donated back to the Virgin Islands. Half goes to our Climate Change Trust Fund, which hopefully I'll discuss a bit later in the program, which is a key mechanism for us building resilience to climate change. And the other half goes directly to survivors that are featured in the book. So at this stage, Megan, if I may, I'd like to just share a few quick readings from the Irma Diaries, which I think illustrate some very important points when it comes to thinking about these disasters, climate change, resilience building. So if I may.
Thanks, Angela. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I'll start with the story Gunpoint. While the situation and threat were serious, it all seemed manageable up until that weekend when it was still in the region of a reasonable storm, a Category 3. The house had withstood several Category 3 and 4 hurricanes without any serious damage. I remember hearing on Monday or Tuesday that Irma had strengthened to a Category 5, with sustained winds of 175 miles per hour and then 185 miles per hour. Disbelief was the feeling. Something must be wrong, I thought. That's unreal, unheard of. Those numbers just can't be right, I kept telling myself. Nothing can withstand that kind of wind force. The situation was unnerving. Apart from the fact that we lived in the downstairs unit, we had made a conscious decision to ride out the storm in that space. With our hurricane shutters in place, solid walls around us, and partly sitting under a concrete roof in the back half of the unit, though naturally nervous, we felt reasonably safe. And I'm gonna skip around in the story to sort of bring everything together. So this is now way into their experience in the first half of the storm still. Pacing the hall, Chelsea watched as the dark shadow beneath the door closed. Sorry. Pacing the hall, Chelsea watched as the dark shadow beneath the closed door to the bedroom disappeared and was replaced by light. She instantly understood the meaning of this silent warning. Christine and I scrambled behind Chelsea and Tishan into the safe room with only enough time to slam the door behind us before we heard what sounded like a massive explosion. In one fell swoop, everything north of that room, including the two bedrooms and the living room, was no longer standing, and the daylight, previously shut out by hurricane shutters, walls, and a roof, poured in. The house was an open sepulchre. Not satisfied with the havoc she wreaked in every other room in the house, Irma wrestled ruthlessly to get into our safe room. I could feel the interior wall of the room vibrating violently. I remember standing in fear that the wall would fall in and crush us. I looked across at Chelsea, and she was shaking like a leaf. Somehow, she said, I managed to appear calm. I think she best described how we all felt in that moment. That level of fear is equivalent to being held at gunpoint. My expression for Irma is life altering. The forced decisions post Irma have been agonizing. Homeless and not even able to find a habitable apartment to rent on island, our entire family has no option but to migrate. So those are just glimpses from Gunpoint. I'll share very quickly from High Tide. That house had stood like a champ through the notorious Hurricane Hugo, a Category 4, in 1989, and years later in 1995 through Hurricane Marilyn, a Category 3. We were confidently anticipating a similar experience. In retrospect, nobody really knew what we were headed for. Within minutes and all at once, the water was chest high as if we were hit by a tsunami. Big waves tall enough to clear the two-story buildings that lined the shoreline just a stone's throw away started to roll into the house one after the other. I was paralyzed with fear. I can swim, but couldn't in that moment. Panicked, hysterical, crying and screaming, Tico grabbed me and tried to calm me down with his assuring words. Listen, we are in this together. We are going to make it through. We are going to do it together, or we are going to die together. Do what I say. I don't want to lose you. CRANIUM. With my faith in that tested structure and in God, I really wasn't too worried about Irma. What I couldn't fully appreciate then was that Irma was a beast unlike anything we had ever experienced before. Standing also on the other side of Hugo, a strong Category 4, Irma's next best but distant match, I can safely say that in practice, there is absolutely no linearity between a Category 4 and a Category 5 hurricane experience. If I had to compare the scale of impact, I would rate Hugo's blow at 25% that of Irma's. In fact, the consensus in the Virgin Islands is that Irma was simply off the charts, bigly, and ought to be classified in a realm of her own, a Category 6. And finally, from 21 years ago, Irma has presented a challenge. I have accepted and intend to conquer it. I have a chip on my shoulder for hurricanes now, and Irma has only armored me with one more notch on my hurricane connoisseur belt. Since Irma, I have heard someone on the Weather Channel say that over the next 10 years, the Caribbean will experience more frequent, stronger hurricanes. So I'm not building for a Category 5. I'm building for a Category 10. Irma got me in round 1, but I plan to be ready for round 2 in my new bunker. It's adaptation time. Better, bigger, stronger. So I've just shared those quick readings to really, I think, touch on what are some important points for me as it relates to Hurricane Irma and what it really means for our future in a changing climate. The first point quickly is that Hurricane Irma was really an unprecedented experience. It was the strongest hurricane ever at time of landfall in the Caribbean and anywhere for that matter. So a lot of the devastation that we saw really was something that persons had never experienced before, even though we're strongly built buildings. Much of the buildings that had been destroyed in Hurricane Irma had survived a strong Category 4 perfectly fine. So I want people to appreciate that we're really into an entirely new reality that we have to think very differently about. The second quick point is that being a climate refugee, I think we hear about climate refugee a lot in the context of the Pacific Islands, but as a result of these stronger hurricanes, being a climate refugee is also now presently a Caribbean reality. And we see that from the story Gunpoint and many other stories that I didn't have the opportunity to share. And finally, the last point is that really we need to be building more resiliently. And for me, this goes beyond just thinking about stronger building codes, which is what we're doing, but it has a lot to do with the land and how we build on the land, where we build, how we build with the landscape, how we think about protecting our natural resources in that process, and how we build around naturally more hazardous zones. And the very final point that I hope I get to develop later on is this whole concept of blue skies planning. The real need to plan for the adaptation, I should say, sorry, before a disaster, because disasters are these perfect opportunities to do things very differently, but it's a difficult time to do things differently if you haven't planned in detail in advance. So I will end my introduction there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Angela. That's super strong stuff. I think your readings made your points absolutely clearly and really gave people a sense of what some of the Caribbean islands might have gone through and their inhabitants. I think, given what Angela's just said, I'd like to bring Kate Brown in now from the Global Island Partnership. Kate, what's happening at the global level in order to help countries and territories like the Virgin Islands to deal more effectively with these storms and other extreme weather events that are coming at them, and for which I think it seems that from what Angela said, it's very difficult to be prepared enough.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And Angela, I think that the stories are really critical to share them because we don't hear them enough of how people are experiencing some of these things. And I'm really going to more look at part of what you talked about, which is how we think about preparing before a disaster. So how do we kind of strengthen resilience more than looking at after a disaster has happened? But that also gives you an opportunity to think about that in some ways. I was just on a panel last week with basically everyone on the panel was from Puerto Rico, and the same things are coming up. At the moment, they're deeply still in recovering from the disaster, but they're also starting to think, how do they build back better, if we want to use that phrase, because they know that something is going to happen again, and they need to kind of, exactly as Angela said, think about all of the ways that they can do something about that. And I think if we think about the title of this this panel, which is about reinventing islands, I think islands have always had to kind of go through this process of reinvention and thinking about how to do things differently. And I really think that with all the islands that we work with, they can really provide an example for everyone, including the whole planet, to think about how to address some of these issues of resilience and sustainability. And I see this really linked to implementation of the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at the international level at some of the things going on there, those which were adopted in 2015 and really enable us to take a more integrated approach to some of these issues around resilience and sustainability. And part of the reinvention of islands is really built on the idea of them working together with each other on ways to ensure that there's some ambition, a high ambition from political leaders, both from islands, but also pushing that at the international level, alongside kind of more what we see with what Angela's talking about, practical solutions, particularly to issues around financing and collaboration for resilience. So how do we overcome some of those things? And then I think it's really important to also kind of share some of the examples of building resilience. What are the kind of more local and regional initiatives and partnerships that are being undertaken that all kind of demonstrate this mix of high ambition commitments and kind of some way of measuring goals and impact that we can sort of see in islands all around the world. And I wanted to highlight, so we're a partnership that was founded 12 years ago by two political leaders from islands, the Seychelles and Palau. But now we have 5 chairs, which includes actually the Premier of the British Virgin Islands and the President of the Marshall Islands and the Prime Minister of Grenada alongside Seychelles and Palau. And we're very focused on this issue of making political commitments, demonstrating action in islands, using that to advocate for the issues that islands need to advocate upon, particularly around climate change, resilience and financing, and then looking at how we can share and enable collaboration amongst islands on some of these things. And some examples I'm going to share, for example, in the Seychelles, which is one of our chairs, they, a number of years ago, were looking at this issue of resilience and decided to do a debt conversion, which is really focused on marine conservation and climate adaptation. And that was actually finalized in 2015. But I think the exciting thing about it is it frees up fiscal space in the Seychelles for the government and others to actually invest in this whole resilience building space. So they're not continuously servicing loans. And so Seychelles actually now has a national trust fund, kind of along the lines of what is now existing in the British Virgin Islands, called SACAT, and that is basically managing the proceeds of the debt swap or debt conversion. And in fact, it's just announced a few months ago its second grant period, and a national trust fund in Seychelles now is granting about $700,000 this year to local projects and local organizations, really to strengthen resilience. I think that's really exciting. We're starting to see kind of resources going at a very local level, and the decisions on that being driven locally. Then we also have in Palau, our Palau president 3 years ago actually decided to launch the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, which means that by 2020 they'll have about 80% of their exclusive economic zone under the Palau National Marine Sanctuary Act. The remaining 20% basically we use for traditional fishing and domestic fishing, but it's very regulated. But I think the exciting thing about that is that you're sort of seeing this desire to manage better the resources in Palau in a way that helps them strengthen their resilience to things that are happening to change. And then I also want to highlight our own within GLISMA, and I think Stewart will talk to this also. We have something called the Island Resilience Initiative, which we're looking at how we accelerate kind of system level change, both in islands and also globally, and scaling successful models that can actually implement the Sustainable Development Goals and other international agreements like the Sendai framework and others more focused on disaster, and how that can be done at a local level and also build resilience. So we have been working there really to highlight what Hawaii has done. Hawaii kind of joined with other islands to develop their own national state level commitment called the Aloha Plus Challenge, and I encourage people to look at that. But that's supported by a public-private partnership which helps kind of monitor and measure and helps kind of facilitate the development of goals. And very much it was inspired by what other islands were doing in Micronesia, for example, and in the Caribbean, from the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, which the British Virgin Islands is also a part of. But so this model is really looking at a more local sustainable development goal framework. So it's all very well things happening at the very international level, but how is that being implemented locally? And so, as I said, it's kind of the public-private partnership model that helps coordinate across sectors and silos. So again, touching on what Angela said, we don't have just kind of climate change sitting over here and infrastructure in a different space, and there's no kind of coordination between those. Just trying to look at how do you overcome that. I think the exciting thing about this is also that there's actually an open data dashboard that measures progress and provides accountability. And so we're actually undertaking a project with other partners, including UNDP and Precovery Labs, to try and trial doing this in 3 other islands, which is being undertaken at the moment. And then I think the third part of this rethinking about how to do these things is the need really to look at where's the project pipeline and the financing that's going to come behind that helps advance implementation. So kind of how we move from ideas to projects to resources. And I think some of the issues for islands can't be solved by islands themselves on these issues, and we have to kind of work together to do it. And I think that, you know, the thing that's really important is that looking at this type of success in SDG implementation from an islander lens is the critical part of this. How does it work at an island, in an island setting, with island local culture, context and values? That is important, especially if we're looking at the issue of resilience. And then, sorry, and I was just going to finally say that last week we actually launched, we had 2 new partners join with us in the Island Resilience Initiative, which is Grid Market and EarthX, who have the support of a Texan millionaire who wants to offer island and coastal communities, particularly in our partnership, support to the renewable energy and resilient infrastructure goals. So really looking at how to transition. And if people are interested in more information about that, we can supply it. But they want to help develop energy roadmaps and to implement distributed energy projects. And that will be underwritten by EarthX. So that's a really exciting thing. And next year, EarthX, so our new island resilience partner, will have actually a whole pavilion on island resilience at the world's largest environment expo in Texas. So EarthX 2019 will have an island-focused element. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. That just goes to show how much is actually going on. There is really a huge amount happening in this space, and lots of new models that are being tested. And so I'm going to bring in Axel de Vries from EY Dutch Caribbean at this point to talk a little bit more about the role of the private sector in supporting efforts by islands to become more resilient. I mean, you know, EY is obviously a very big global company, but I think you're getting involved at the local level as well as the wider level. I know that you did some interesting work in St. Martin earlier this year, which was affected by the hurricanes too. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how that worked, Axel, and what EY's role was, and the ideas that came out of that.
Yes, I can. Well, yeah, EY is a global firm, of course, but we're integrated within the Caribbean. And I'm part of the Dutch Caribbean, and the Dutch Caribbean consists of the islands Curaçao, Aruba, St. Martin, and some smaller islands. And although Curaçao is not in close to St. Martin, we work together a lot. We have a lot of clients there on St. Martin, and after the hurricane Irma, there was a lot of direct help, and I was very glad that a lot of things were happening. But a couple of months later, it was getting a bit quiet, and okay, we wanted to do something extra. And I was very pleased to meet Arno Boersma from the Center of Excellence for the Sustainable Development of the SIDS on Aruba and the UNDP initiative. And we said, okay, how can we work together, and what can we do? We want to see some action. So that's why we organized some kind of hackathon, a do tank. And it turned out to be a big event, 5-day event. A lot of people from the Netherlands, from the Dutch Antilles came to Sint Maarten, and a lot of people from Sint Maarten as well joined us to just discuss and to come up with ideas. What can we do? Because I think it's very important to have some promotion of the private sector and just come up with ideas and promoting that the economy has to grow again. We have to do something. And what can we do without the government's involvement? And so we had the hackathon, the do tank. There were so many people joining us, 160 participants, and they come up with 21 great ideas. And the winner of the event, they are launching their product next month. And they just came up with the idea of, it's named Greenbox. And they came up with the idea to get all the plastics and collecting all these kind of waste initiatives. Because there was no solution from the government. They were burning dump, the dump was burning. It gave a lot of problems. People were talking about that for 10 years already. And just with this idea and very simple and easy startup idea, now it's going to help, and now it's going to really do something for the environment. So that was very awesome, and it was a lot of positive energy.
I'm sure there's probably some interest among people who are watching and listening today in this kind of an event. So I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't get some questions about that. But in terms of also what Kate was saying about the bigger picture, some of these more international initiatives, how do you see the private sector being able to support, say, for example, the development of more resilient infrastructure? Obviously initiatives, local initiatives, small and medium enterprises, community driven ideas are key, but also there's a need for big money and sort of logistical support when it comes to infrastructure. Is that something that EY has ideas about?
Yeah, so what we see is that there are a lot of opportunities for public-private partnerships, of course. For example, on Aruba, they just created a new road or working with the private sector. So the private sector is just financing, build it, operate it, everything. And that's a very easy method. And the government just has to say, okay, this is what we want, and this is what you're gonna get. We're gonna pay for 20 or 30 years for everything, all the costs, but we don't have to invest upfront. That the private sector can do. Even on this island, on Curacao, we have the refinery, and just give the concession to a private party, and they can do everything for you. But the government can help with, okay, but it has to be sustainable, it has to be green, whatever. And those kind of things need to happen more often.
Right, thanks very much, Axel. Yes, I think that's an interesting point that you make about it having to be sustainable and having to be green, because sometimes with private sector initiatives, we see that in the past, those aspects have not necessarily been incorporated as much as required, but there does seem to be a shift in thinking around those, especially where businesses have had their assets affected by disasters. I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to bring Stewart in from Precovery Labs right now to reflect on some of the things that we've heard so far from our experts. Stewart, you're a very experienced resilience practitioner. What have you found interesting about what's been said so far today? You know, what would your advice be in terms of how do we bring it all together?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that this is a tough group to follow on from, and we did sort of, each of the speakers covered a different area that I think we have to always keep in mind. And I think one of the things that reading from the book does immediately is you start to realize we have to remember sort of the humans that are in the middle. It's part of what we designed for the Island Resilience Initiative, right? We have to think about the citizen or the human in the sort of center of all of this that we're doing, and be holistic about it. So you hear from Angela, like the disaster doesn't discriminate. You hear from Kate that we have to have partnerships and we have to share the solutions, but we also have to go from, as we say, from the coral up, starting very local, and then going all up to the highest levels. So you need the global leadership, and you need to tie it to impact, and you need to tie it to other global frameworks. But when it comes right down to it, there are people living in homes, or there are businesses, and there are trades and tourism and everyday life that must return from where they are after the hurricane. So, and then you hear from Axel, what I think is key to what we're doing on the Island Resilience Initiative as the long-term goal, but also what I think Axel and the center that we partnered with, I was down there in St. Martin and was very inspired by seeing the local entrepreneurship and the ability to kind of bring these things forward. But what that tells you is that there's a demand for the solutions. People want to engage, but we hear it again and again. Money has to meet implementation. Money has to meet projects. We are tired of just talking, which tends to happen sometimes at the global level. We want to do. So I think each of the speakers, in a sense, brought those elements. It's why the Island Resilience Initiative was created. It was inspired by, in my case, Precovery Labs comes out of having worked on hurricane recovery and hurricane task force, but also doing indigenous work around economic and community development, thinking about higher level kind of global frameworks and what they mean for people who, quote unquote, have to comply with SDGs or Paris climate. Meanwhile, they're still recovering from cyclones and hurricanes. And we know that in Fiji, we're still recovering in various places from Winston. And we know this is going to go on for some time with Irma and other places. And so the Island Resilience Initiative that Kate touched on is trying to link those global frameworks with impact collection to drive towards sustainable solutions that have a precovery mindset rather than being in recovery all the time, so that we're looking at things that start to focus on the resilience of place. And it isn't just climate resilience. It isn't just disaster risk reduction. That focus is important, especially when you know that bad things can happen. And part of what's important for us is to bring together the various elements that you've heard each of the speakers say, and then start to look at it very holistically. What's that broader view of education, health, infrastructure, economics? Because the islands in the Caribbean right now are really suffering because 80 to 90% of GDP might be based on tourism. And if you lose even a portion of that, what do you think that does from an economic standpoint to people who are already in a hardship place? So much like any other disaster, people at a low to moderate income or marginalized are hurt more just because of living circumstances in business. And so I think the challenge for the three speakers and all of us that are in this together is to weave that holistic view and then think, as Angela said, ahead rather than backwards, right? This is precovery rather than recovery, because what do we do for the next one? And how do we be better prepared? So category 10, I don't know if we'll ever get there, if we'll call it that, but that's the mentality that we're looking for, something that has that kind of mindset.
Right, thanks, Stewart. That's a really helpful and unusual and new way of thinking with this precovery mindset, instead of always trying to come back after a disaster and then not be ready for the next one. And on that note, I wanted to bring in some questions that we're receiving from the participants in the webinar. And I think we'll go straight to those and encourage other people who are on this event to pop their questions in the chat at the side. So the first one I have here is from Alex Diaz, editor of the Resilience Journal blog, resiliencejournal.com. He says the science is brutal, the disasters will get so much worse. And given our island vulnerabilities, we may be looking at few islands surviving as livable places. And how much attention is being given to that scenario? I mean, you know, today and in our series that we have been pushing out this week, we've been looking at some of the positive things that islands are doing. Just because that tends to be an aspect that's less covered, and as Kate said, there's an awful lot going on. But I'm just wondering whether Angela might like to come in on this question. After Irma in the Virgin Islands, were people really thinking that, you know, the BVI would not be a livable place or will not be a livable place in the future? And if so, do some people still feel like that, or people tend to have a very strong sense of attachment to where they come from and want to stay at all costs, right? What's your view on that as somebody who's been through this? Angela, I think you need to unmute your microphone, otherwise we shan't hear your wise words.
Thank you. No, thank you for that question. That's a very, very important topic to discuss. Just from a personal perspective, first and foremost, I've now been working on climate change for the past 10 years or so. And I will confess that Hurricane Irma was the first real moment for me when I felt like I could actually become a climate refugee, you know, within my young lifetime. And I think the whole experience has brought that reality home to many people that live in the British Virgin Islands. Certainly, many people have already left. Many people have already made that decision that I just cannot continue my life here because I've lost everything. Does it make sense to restart when we know that next hurricane season, and this is sort of a real living fear, right? Next hurricane season, the same thing might happen again. I mean, you're talking about a country where in our tourism sector alone, the impact was 2.5 times the entire GDP. And we're now looking at taking out loans to try to recover that will last for multiple generations. So you've basically maxed out your borrowing capacity on a singular event. So at a very personal individual level and at a country scale, you start to wonder, you know, is life on these islands going to be sustainable if we're hit by these kind of destructive events on a more frequent cycle? And many people are still going through the trauma of recovering from Hurricane Irma. It's a very traumatizing and stressful experience. And, you know, just the anxiety that existed last season following Hurricane Irma, and this was across the islands. Hurricane Irma was on 6th of September. Normally what you would see happen is people would take down their boards, their shutters immediately following a hurricane because you're without light, you're without air. That never happened. People were so terrified from that experience that people literally left their shutters up until the very end of hurricane season plus. And it's a good thing that we did. I mean, 2 weeks after Irma, there was Maria, another category 5 that we barely escaped a very direct hit from. And this year, again, people have a high level of anxiety going into the hurricane season. I mean, when we look at what happened with Maria and Dominica, Maria was literally a tropical storm turned into a category 5 hurricane within a 24-hour cycle, which is simply unheard of, unprecedented. So I think there's a whole new level of awareness and thinking around hurricane season. And many people have told me personally, and I've heard it publicly elsewhere, that I simply cannot do this again. I might survive or I might come back from it, but I cannot conceive if this level of devastation were to happen again, having to restart my life and go through this all over again. So I think certainly for me and most people that live here, this idea of becoming a refugee is now very much a reality. And the urgent question for all of us is, how do we work together within our own spaces? But as Kate says, it really is going to take a global partnership. How does the world come together to save these islands? Because there is a strong attachment to place. I certainly can't begin to think about my life outside of my island home, outside of the Caribbean. And I don't think it's a fair reality that persons should have to, when there's so many alternatives out there that could save our future. We know the problem, the solution.
Absolutely, Angela. I think it's very, it's at the forefront of people's minds right now. I think in the Pacific, obviously, this issue of climate-related migration is maybe, and they've also suffered major typhoons and cyclones, but I think also to do with rising seas and the impact of that on food and water. Obviously, some Pacific Island states have been putting in place some potential ways of moving people if they have to, such as buying land and that kind of thing. And just on that point, one perhaps positive international development is that in the Global Compact on Migration that was agreed just very recently in New York, their climate-related drivers of displacement are very firmly mentioned in there, and the need for states to develop solutions for people who are impacted by those factors. I mean, obviously one hopes that it won't be necessary for people to move unless they want to. But I think that the international community is perhaps waking up a little bit to the need to have a bit more of a formal approach, more organized, etc. Just moving on, because we don't have lots of time. We have a second question I have here. I'm not sure who would potentially like to answer this, so please do unmute yourself and dive in if it's your area. Given the unique characteristics and challenges, how can island territories leverage their potential and transform from small island states to smart island states? So if somebody on our panel is well versed in the technology side of things, in how we can use digital solutions, I see Axel has unmuted himself, so perhaps you're willing to dive in on that one. I mean, smart islands is become a big kind of topic of conversation these days. So so please go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, smart islands, we are all talking about it, the government is talking about it, but it's very, very difficult for these small islands to be better than San Francisco or than Amsterdam or whatever. But there are so many small initiatives here on the islands, so many smart people that can come up with great ideas just for the local situation. And so that's why we're helping the startup ecosystem, just helping young entrepreneurs with their ideas, and they can be here on the island and they can scale up to the other islands and even in the whole world. And that would be great for the economic growth, the brain gain instead of the brain drain that we all have experienced. Coming up, just stimulating the people here on the islands to come up with the good ideas, how we can be smarter. And I think also it's very important to have it for a sustainable future. The ideas that are available are so important to be resilient. So just stimulating that ecosystem, that's important.
Right, thanks, Axel. And I think Stewart also has some input in terms of what smart islands, people interested in smart islands can learn from what's been done on smart cities, right, Stewart?
Yeah, I was starting to type the answer, and I think it's just easier to say it quickly. The Global Island Partnership and Precovery Labs and the Center of Excellence and others have been involved the last 2 years, the 2 inaugural years of the Smart Islands World Congress. And next year, we're going to be an even bigger partner in that. And I think part of what's really important is, as we've heard from the smart cities people, you don't do just tech and good data and smart for the sake of doing it. It has to actually have a sort of impact and a purpose. And I think that's the case for the islands as well. And even more so in the sense that, like, reduced resources mean that if technology is making you more resilient, more sustainable, safer, and is engaging the local economic system and entrepreneurs, it's even better. I think one of the things that we've concentrated on, and we did this at the Smart Islands World Congress this past April, and that is to go from that global idea down to a project level where technology is being used. So we featured new ways of doing fisheries and marine protected area monitoring. We featured sail-driven ferries, which is a favorite of mine because in the Caribbean as well as in the Pacific, these short, dangerous rides that are often with very old ferries and boats, we could change that and go back to a traditional form, but have a modern look at it. So I think, you know, innovation doesn't mean invention. It also means sort of adapting and transitioning. And so I think one thing that we're seeing is how SMART really supports resilience and being practical about it with those kinds of examples.
Does SMART have to be expensive, Stewart, in your experience?
No, not at all. I mean, you know, I recall being in Fiji 2 years ago and looking at some post-Winston, and there's videos of them on my Instagram if you go look at it, and on Glispa's Instagram. But looking at things that make it very simple to prepare for a cyclone when it's coming. And these aren't super high tech, but they're really smart in the sense that, like, a greenhouse that folds up and all of the crates go into containers that then save all the plants that are used for responding and replanting. It's just, smart can mean low tech and high tech, and it can mean data, but it can also mean all these other things as well.
Right, it's interesting. One of our attendees on the webinar has mentioned about using materials, you know, after a disaster, for example, from boats, using abandoned, damaged boats as temporary shelters or repurposing them as small homes. She says they were made from fiberglass primarily and shells that were virtually indestructible, and many could have been used for habitation rather than chopped up and sent to landfill. I thought that was an interesting idea. I think Kimiko has been working in Puerto Rico, if I'm not wrong. And I just thought that was an interesting idea from somebody here on the webinar of resourcefulness and, you know, how can we approach these problems on the small scale as well as the large scale. If anybody has any other questions, please do feel free to put those into the chat. Another question I wanted to ask our panelists about was energy. And energy resilience. I mean, there are so many issues around energy for islands, many of whom have to import dirty, polluting bunker fuel and diesel. And in our series this week, we've had a couple of stories about islands switching to renewable energy and using smart batteries and a whole system that will allow them to become more self-sufficient in terms of energy and much cleaner. But I'm just wondering also from the perspective of disasters, how does one disaster-proof those new energy systems that are being put in? And do you think, for example, Kate, in the initiative that you had launched at the high-level political forum, that this is going to be considered enough in the work that's being done on energy transition? Because without resilience of those energy systems, that could be an expensive mistake, if you like.
Yeah, and I think definitely that will be part of the planning. We actually talked about this on the Puerto Rico panel on the other day, because I was just saying that I remember we had a hurricane or cyclone, we call it, in Samoa, and there was the option to bury the power because we lost power for, I think, 6 weeks or something. It was a long time. The wires were tangled all over the place. But that option wasn't taken because it was too expensive. So they were put back up on the poles. And so it's kind of the same thing. It was, so it's kind of like really changing our thinking a little bit and maybe moving outside the political cycle. How do we make some of these transformative things happen when we're looking kind of more at the short-term financing problems that we might have? So how does, like, a country like Samoa get the money to actually bury the power line so that we don't kind of get that. This is from traditional power, and then looking kind of more at things where you have a lot of hurricanes and others. Yeah, definitely that has to be part of the planning as we move forward.
And I think, you know, some of those types of projects and initiatives will require big money, you know, because we're talking about infrastructure and burying power lines, etc. Do you think that islands are, you know, having a fair shot at getting international funds from places like the Green Climate Fund, climate finance, and those kind of vehicles that can provide funding for these types of projects? I mean, Angela mentioned that Virgin Islands have set up a Climate Change Trust Fund. Just wondering, Angela, if you can reflect a bit on how, you know, that is going to be in the future. Do you see that Climate Change Trust Fund as a conduit for donor money, for investors? How do you see that panning out?
Thank you. There are so many things I want to comment on, but I'll start directly on that question. So, as we had said in our pre-call, Megan, the British Virgin Islands really finds itself as an island country in a very peculiar situation. So even though we're a small island country, we're still very much a developing country, because we are a territory, an overseas territory of the UK, we actually don't have the same access that other independent small islands do to the Green Climate Fund and any of the other mechanisms that are administered through the United Nations framework on climate change, etc., in terms of gaining access to resources, for whether it's in technology transfer or adaptation or mitigation efforts. So we've really come up with the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund as sort of an innovative in-house approach to try to get around this challenge. We've basically put in place all of the institutional framework that's necessary to be able to access funds. So we have a very solid climate change policy. We have an institutional framework in the form of our Climate Change Committee, and now that's supported by our recently established Climate Change Trust Fund. And that trust fund is being set up to actually meet international standards so that it can be, for instance, accredited through the Green Climate Fund, with the hope that with those systems in place that can be recognized as transparent and meeting those high standards, that even though we cannot access the Green Climate Fund, for instance, we might be able to get the attention of individual countries that might want to partner and support the Virgin Islands in our efforts. Or there are a number of independently wealthy persons. Kate mentioned the gentleman in Texas who is interested in invested in islands. So we're hoping to really grab the attention of whether philanthropists, countries, independently wealthy friends of BVI, to put monies into that Climate Change Trust Fund where they will be transparently, independently managed and really get to very local on-the-ground projects to support both mitigation and adaptation. And renewable energy is a huge focus of the Trust Fund. We see that not just as a mitigation issue, but very much a resilience issue. I mean, in the Virgin Islands, it took a solid 6 months before the entire community was restored with electricity. So you can imagine the huge setback that created in terms of just the recovery effort. And we do have a policy in place from before Hurricane Irma that has a target of achieving 30%, I think, renewable energy penetration by 2023. So we have very ambitious goals. It's about trying to bring the finances to the table that would allow us to implement those measures. Same as with Kate, the idea of burying lines has been around for a long time, but how do you afford doing it? So, sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. And I was going to say that, you know, in terms of being able to attract that funding, having the governance structures in place, such as a climate change trust fund that can demonstrate, you know, all the due diligence and the transparency and monitoring that donors and investors require will surely, I hope, be positive in terms of helping the Virgin Islands attract the money that it needs. I'm just aware that we don't have a great deal of time left, although there really is a lot more to say on this subject. And I wanted to finish up. We don't I don't think we have other questions coming in right now, so that's a good point. We may run slightly over time if that's okay with everybody, but I just wanted to give our four panelists an opportunity to explain to the people who are watching and listening how they think islands can best share their knowledge and experience with others in order for everybody to be able to profit. I don't mean that in a financial sense, I mean that in terms of resilience building to the maximum, because a lot of people in the chat on the side have been talking about, you know, wanting to hook up afterwards and find out more about the things that you have been talking about. And I think, you know, that is one of the key things that we wanted to draw out from this event, which is how can islands be living laboratories for some of these initiatives. So if you would like to just take a couple of minutes each to talk about how you think that knowledge scaling up can best be done, that knowledge sharing, I think that would be of great interest to the people who are watching and listening today. Can I start perhaps with Stewart on that? Sorry to spring it on you, Stewart.
I thought you were going to pick me last, so I was busy in the chat window. So I think, in particular, as a member organization to GLISPA and in support of the Island Resilience Initiative, we see that the exchange between the islands is very important, and I personally feel that it's really important to get as many islands as members of varying levels involved in a partnership like this, because it's islands of all sizes. We learned from Cozumel as much as we learned from the Canary Islands and any of them that are on the call right now, but also going out to the Pacific where we're doing the pilots in the Marshall Islands, in Fiji and Palau. So it feels much more relevant when it's all islands and across island supporters. I also think that this finance piece, I won't spend any time on it, but that is something we're trying to unlock. And so partnering on how we scale solutions across islands so that we can move the funding in a way that gets people access where projects meet financing. A recent meeting of 23 permanent representatives and ministers in Antigua and Barbuda, this was, every time the conversation got to projects getting financing, everybody said, we can't get the projects ready to get the financing never reaches them. So I think, you know, we're hearing this on 100 Resilient Cities, where I also work as well, because I'm working on finance there. This is a common problem, and I think we have to solve that together in addition to the solutions themselves.
Thanks, Stewart. Axel, how do you think a company like EY can help with that issue of getting the money to meet the projects, and indeed sharing that knowledge and among the private sector? You know, one of the comments that people make is the projects are too small or they need to be aggregated. Yes. How do you share those needs and those ideas among business and potential investors?
Yeah, it's very difficult in the Caribbean. I'm glad that we are integrated within the Dutch and the English-speaking Caribbean islands, but we also have the French-speaking islands, of course, and that's even hard within EY, a global firm. So I can easily connect with my colleagues and then say, okay, this company wants to do something on this area. Please come in contact with my colleague there. And we can share information. We have a global knowledge database, so that's easy for us. But still, the circumstances, the things that are happening on the islands are so different. And Angela was also talking about we are a high-income country connected to the Netherlands, so we're not able to get the funds from the IMF or the World Bank or whatever, even not from the European Union. So a lot of things have to be arranged, let me say it like that. And we can help with that, just sharing knowledge. And I'm also very glad that we have the Center of Excellence on Aruba that is sharing their knowledge. They have a lot of insights and know what is happening in the whole world. But yeah, we have to stimulate it and just bring people together.
Absolutely, Kate. GLISPA, the Global Island Partnership, does that. It's part of its reason for being. Where do you see this these efforts to share the learning by doing, you know, as the needs increase?
Yeah, I think at regional level, there's a lot of sharing in regions, although there are some barriers, language barriers, for example, in the Caribbean with the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, for example. But I think when you get to the between regions, really, it's not as strong as it could be. We try to help with that, and as do some others. I think where there's real barriers actually is kind of what Angela and Axel were talking about, which is there's kind of organized groups of islands, for example, the small island developing states. They meet a lot regularly. They have kind of channels for doing that. But it's all these other islands like Puerto Rico, like Aruba, Hawaii, Cayman Islands, and so forth, have different ways. They also, groups of them also meet. But how do we, what we're trying to look at is how we bridge between all of these with the islands that are trying to do something and want to share, because not everyone actually does want to. And I think the sharing has to be kind of at multiple levels. It's the political level at different levels, and then it's kind of more at a practitioner level. We need to kind of foster that. We very much do a lot of sharing at international events to try and bring the island message from all levels there. And we probably could do that a lot more. And I think we're getting some great ideas even from this. And, you know, like a lot of the things, even looking at the chat window that people are identifying, I know islands that have done some of the things that are being identified there just because of my kind of global remit. So how do we kind of get that to happen? I think more webinars like this are really going to help do that. You know, I would suggest that one on kind of the financing issue for islands is really critical. And because I think Angela and Axel have touched on one part of the issue, and so has Stewart, but it's also the issue of scale and size and risk that islands face. What is our solution to that? How do we enable private investment? And the second part of that is something that Angela also said, which is that they have to borrow money to recover from this hurricane that is going to last for generations. All of those Caribbean countries are doing that because they're having to borrow the private market, non-concessionary loans. And so you're just endlessly borrowing money and kind of sinking further and further into a space where you can't develop out of that. So that's a reality. What's the solution to that?
Right, I think that's a great suggestion, Kate, that maybe we could drill down into specific issues, perhaps in future. But that's noted because then at that point, you know, more tools are made available and discussed in detail. And I think today what we've been doing is looking at the broad picture. And within that, there is a lot going on. I'd like to give the last word to Angela, because I think, Angela, you've been doing some pretty interesting work off the back of your book, you know, going around to different places, actually sharing experiences, you know, directly between people in universities, that kind of thing. And what's your experience of trying to share knowledge about how to cope with some of the challenges that face the Virgin Islands?
Right. Well, thank you for that, Megan. A lot to say on this. I think this topic of knowledge sharing is so very important, in addition to sharing the experiences, because the experiences make it real. It makes it tangible for people. On the matter, first of all, of sharing knowledge between islands, in the Caribbean to date, that has really happened, I think, through the work of regional projects that tend to bring us islands together around common themes. So I would think immediately of the work that the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center has done and the ongoing projects that are happening now through the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, in particular, the Island Resilience Project, which is really doing a lot of wonderful work to think about adaptation to climate change through the lens of sustainable land management. And we're doing a lot in BVI through that. And so when we're involved in these projects, we have the opportunity to share experiences with the other islands that are also involved at the time. But I would like to see knowledge sharing move beyond that project-based cycle, where we're thinking at a global scale across the Caribbean, Pacific, and other islands. And where I would really love to see, I don't know if it would be GLISP or somebody else who could do it, but some sort of very structured database online that's very user-friendly, where it's almost sort of a problem solution setup where I could easily go, and I've had these questions several times, if I could go easily to somewhere on the web and I could think about problems that I'm facing, such as, you know, how do I deal with sea level rise and the issue of having to migrate persons from one island to the next within my country because some islands are more vulnerable than others. How do I look at coastal retreat, which is a huge problem that we all have to tackle? I don't know whether or not there are any good solutions as yet. How do I deal with having to retreat whole communities? How do I make communities more flood resilient? How do I think about land use planning that is climate smart? I think if we had these sort of problems that, yes, we all have very different local contexts, but we have a lot of the shared problems. So if we set up a database that we can just go to and see how people are responding in their different situations to these shared problems, certainly I think that would be very instructive for me as somebody who's very active on the ground in the work of adaptation. Now, in terms of sharing my experience and sharing the Hurricane Irma stories and how those have been received, I think it's even more powerful than I had anticipated when I started. I mean, you mentioned my work at universities. So I did a tour across universities in the Northeast, and the reactions I got were sort of beyond my expectations. For instance, following one presentation, a group of students actually went out and protested their university trustees to divest all of the university's investments away from fossil fuel. And, you know, filmmakers have come to me, approached me, wanting to know more about climate change so that they can incorporate it into their film work. Persons, you know, a grandmother has approached me, you know, I have a new inspiration to work on climate change. How can I get involved? So I think this storytelling approach is actually, it's a new way. I think it's a novel way. I think it's a powerful way to actually connect people to this issue. And I'm hoping that it doesn't end with the Irma Diaries. I want to see the work that I've done actually spark other people in other places to share stories, because I think everybody has a climate change story and it's not just islands. And so part of this knowledge sharing, I think, should be sharing those stories from the front lines. And the Irma Diaries, like I said, is hopefully just going to be a start and an example of what that can be like.
That's amazing, Angela. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased that we've had the opportunity to share a little bit in some of those stories that you spent so much time and effort collecting. And as you say, it just shows the power of storytelling, which is also something that we are trying to do this week with our series on islands resilience. And if you go to zilient.org, you will see a range of islands and people and solutions represented there, from the Caribbean to Europe and Asia. And I would like to wrap up there. We've gone a little bit over time, but I thought what you had to say was so valuable that people would bear with us. And just to say that we will be posting a video of this discussion. Apologies for any technical issues at the beginning. We will post a video of this discussion on zilient.org with a blog that will contain some of the key takeaways from the discussion and hopefully some links. But if anyone who's watching or listening would like more information, please do get in touch with us. I think my colleagues have been posting about that on the side in the chat. But just to say thank you so much to our panelists today for sharing their knowledge, their insight and their experiences. And I hope that we will be able to keep up this conversation via zilient.org in the future. So thank you very much, everybody, to our panelists for their contributions, and also to the people who have been chatting away on the side of the webinar. I hope this has been an interesting conversation, and we'll be back again next month with a different subject. But for now, please do check out the Islands Resilience series on zilient.org. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye for now.